First, lift and support the unit per manufacturer's requirements. Remember to lift the unit by the frame and never by the axle or suspension components. Next, remove the tire from the hub by removing the wheel lugs. This can be done with an impact driver. Ensure that the socket stops spinning before moving on to the next lug. Also, be sure to hang on to the lugs as they will be used for reinstallation. Once all the lugs have been removed, remove the tire from the hub itself and roll away for later. To remove the dust cap, use a flathead screwdriver to gently pry it away from the hub. Using pliers, straighten out the cotter pin to make it easier to remove from the spindle head. This cotter pin can be discarded as a new one will be used for reinstallation. Without the cotter pin holding it in place, now the castle nut can be backed off and removed from the spindle head. Next, remove the washer and the outer bearing from the spindle. With one palm over the hub for additional support, remove the hub from the axle. To disconnect the wires, cut the power and ground wires between the axle beam and the backer plate. Using a drill and the appropriate size socket, we're going to remove the backer plate with the brake assembly from the spindle itself. These 4 bolts and washers will have to be removed and set aside for later installation. The brake assembly can now be removed from the spindle. Next, remove the nuts from the U-bolts and set aside for later. Do the same with the tie plate. Once the U-bolts have been removed, these can be discarded as new ones will be used upon reinstallation. Also, up until this point, all the same steps and components will need to be done on the other side of the axle beam before continuing in this procedure. After removing all the same components from the opposite side of the axle beam, use a floor jack to gently lift the axle beam up off the leaf springs so that the axle beam can be removed from under the unit. With the axle brake wires and axle tag facing the rear of the unit, guide the new axle beam under the unit so that it's positioned between the leaf springs. Also, so that it's positioned above the leaf springs. This will make it easier to install. Ensure that the center bolt on the leaf spring is seated properly on the brackets beneath the axle beam on both sides. Double check to ensure that the axle tag is facing the rear of the unit, as well as the brake wires. Now that the axle beam is properly seated, it's time to replace the tie plate and the U-bolts. Upon inspection, the tie plate will need to be replaced if necessary. However, this is not mandatory. The U-bolts, on the other hand, are mandatory as far as using brand new ones upon reinstallation. Once both U-bolts are situated in the tie plate and the tie plate is centered underneath the leaf spring, hand tighten the nuts for each of the U-bolt threads. When tightening down the nuts on the U-bolts further, use a crisscross pattern to ensure that the U-bolts and the nuts are seated in a manner that makes them even. In other words, the thread that's coming out of each nut should be even between all of the U-bolts. The U-bolt nuts will need to be tightened down to a specific torque spec. For a 2K axle, 25 foot-pounds is the proper torque spec. 3.5K with a 1/2-inch U-bolt is 50 foot-pounds. 5.2K axle is 65 foot-pounds, and 6 to 8K axles is 90 foot-pounds. Next, install the backer plate onto the new beam. Once it's seated, the washers and nuts that attach the backer plate to the axle beam can be reinstalled. Once all the nuts have been reinstalled onto the backer plate, they can be tightened further using a crisscross pattern to ensure that the backer plate is seated in an even fashion on the axle beam. Using a torque wrench and the same crisscross pattern method, tighten down the nuts to 35 foot-pounds. Now it's time to rewire the axle. Find the power and ground wires coming out of the axle beam and the backer plate assembly, and connect the wires accordingly. Be sure to crimp down the connector all the way so that the connection on the wire is solid. This will reduce the risk of any electrical concerns down the road. Next, reinstall the hub onto the axle beam. The outer bearing, washer, and castle nut can now be reinstalled on the axle spindle. Hand tighten the axle nut down until it's finger tight. The castle nut now needs to be tightened down to 50 foot-pounds to seat the bearing properly inside the hub. Once this torque spec has been reached, use a breaker bar to back off the castle nut and then hand tighten it. Reinstall a new cotter pin down through the spindle to secure the castle nut in place. You'll do this by wrapping the end of the cotter pin around each side of the castle nut. Next, reinstall the dust cap onto the hub. With the axle hub now reassembled, the tire can be reinstalled onto the hub itself. Once the tire has been seated onto the face of the hub, hand tighten the wheel lugs. When tightening down the wheel lugs further, do so in a sequential pattern that allows for the tire to sit evenly and flush against the hub face. Ensure that the socket stops spinning before moving on to the next lug. Using a floor jack, lift the frame so that the jack stand supporting the frame can now be removed. Finally, using a torque wrench, set it to the proper torque spec in order to secure the wheel lugs properly to the hub.